The cabin was small, 14 feet wide, maybe 16 deep. One room, one door, one window facing south, and no bedroom. Neighbors who stepped inside for the first time always had the same reaction. A pause, a slow look around, a quiet frown. There was a table, a shelf, a cast-iron pot hanging near the hearth. But no bed, no curtain hiding a sleeping corner, no loft overhead, nothing. Some assumed she hadn't finished building yet. Others were less generous. "Where does she sleep?" One local account recalls a visitor asking. "On the floor like an animal?" She didn't answer. She just smiled and set a kettle on the fire. That winter, the winter of the deep freeze, when temperatures in the valley dropped below 14 degrees Fahrenheit for 11 consecutive nights, 3 families in the settlement burned through their entire woodpile by February. They ran short. They huddled. They borrowed and begged. Her fire, by every account, burned no more than any other. She split no extraordinary amount of wood. She hauled no extra stones. And yet, every morning when she rose, the air inside her cabin was warmer than it had any right to be. The cold that cracked bark off the pines outside stopped, somehow, at her walls. No one understood it. Not at first. The answer wasn't hidden in her stove. It wasn't in the wood she burned or the chimney she built. The answer was in a part of the cabin that most visitors never thought to look at twice. It was in the wall itself. If you've ever wondered why old cabins sometimes felt warmer than modern insulated houses, stick around. The answer is stranger and smarter than you'd expect. Subscribe if you're new here, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We read every single one. The settlement sat at the edge of a river valley in the upper Midwest, somewhere between the end of the railroad and the beginning of real wilderness. The year was the late 1870s. The land had been opened for homesteading, and families were arriving by the wagon load. Husbands with axes, wives with seed tins, children with wide eyes, and no understanding of what a northern winter actually meant. Most of the cabins going up that season followed the same rough pattern. Square footprint, log walls chinked with clay and dry grass. A single hearth built against the north or east wall. A sleeping loft reached by a ladder or a curtained corner on the ground floor. Simple, proven, acceptable. One woman built differently. Her name, according to the few handwritten records that survive from that community, was Marta, a Scandinavian immigrant, possibly from the coastal regions of Norway, who had arrived without a husband but not without knowledge. She was in her mid-30s. She had already lived through winters that would have broken most people raised in milder climates. She knew, in a way that only experience teaches, that the enemy was not the cold itself. It was the cold that crept in after the fire died. She chose her plot deliberately. A slight south-facing slope, good drainage, a cluster of mature pines to the northwest that would break the worst of the wind. Neighbors later recalled that she spent nearly 2 full days simply walking the land before she touched a single tree. She was looking for something most settlers never thought to look for: the way the ground held heat, the direction of the prevailing gusts, the angle of the winter sun across the ridge. Then she started building, and she built slowly, deliberately, in a way that puzzled the men who occasionally passed and offered unsolicited advice. Her walls went up thick, far thicker than necessary, most thought. Her foundation stones were larger than anyone else's. She turned down offers of help from neighbors who assumed she was struggling. She wasn't struggling. She was calculating. The cabin that emerged over the course of that autumn was unremarkable from the outside. 14 feet wide, 16 feet deep. A modest structure by any measure. But something about the proportions was slightly off. The interior felt smaller than the exterior suggested, as if the walls themselves had swallowed space that should have been living area. One neighbor who helped her drag a stone across the threshold later told his son, and his son told local historians, that the back wall of that cabin felt different. Not just thick, dense, like pressing your hand against a cliff face rather than a building. Nobody asked why. Not yet. The first snow came in October. Marta split her firewood in careful, measured amounts. She did not rush. She did not stockpile with the same frantic energy as her neighbors. She seemed, to everyone watching, remarkably unconcerned. That calm would look very different by February. To understand what Marta built, you have to stand inside the cabin and look at the back wall. Not the front wall with its door and its single south-facing window. Not the side walls, which were standard log construction, roughly 8 inches of white pine chinked with a clay and moss mixture. The back wall, the north-facing wall. It was, by the estimates of those who later measured it, between 28 and 32 inches thick at its widest point. For context, a standard frontier log cabin wall of the 1870s ran between 8 and 12 inches thick. Double that, and you've already crossed into the territory of extravagance. At 30 inches, you're building something that looks, to an untrained eye, less like a wall and more like a small interior mountain. It consumed stone at a rate that baffled observers. Local accounts suggest Marta hauled field stone from the riverbed over the course of nearly 3 weeks. Limestone and dense sandstone, selected by size and weight with a care that seemed, to most, like obsession. She rejected stones that were too porous. She set aside anything that crumbled at the edges. She wanted mass. Specific, deliberate, unrelenting mass. The wall she built was not a fireplace wall in the conventional sense. It was not a chimney stack. It was more like a thermal core, a column of dense stone that ran the full height of the cabin interior, from the earthen floor to the roof framing, with the firebox set low and deep into its base. The flue did not run straight up. It curved. It wound through the body of the stone before exiting at the top, a path that, though Marta likely had no formal vocabulary for it, maximized the contact time between hot combustion gases and cold rock. The neighbors who saw it under construction had a word for it: wasteful. Stones for foundations, one settler reportedly said, eyeing the rising mass of rock with open skepticism. You're building the whole house inside a foundation. He wasn't entirely wrong. That was precisely the point. What Marta had built, whether she called it by any technical name or simply knew it from watching her grandmother build in coastal Norway, was a rudimentary version of what thermodynamics would later describe as a high-mass radiant heating system. The stone absorbed heat during the burn. Not just surface heat, deep, structural heat, penetrating 6, 8, sometimes 10 inches into the core of the wall. And then, hours after the fire died down to coals, that stored energy began its slow, steady return. Stone does not release heat quickly. That is not a flaw. That is the entire mechanism. A standard cast iron stove of the period could raise a room temperature fast, but it cooled almost as fast as it heated. When the fire dropped, the room dropped. Frontier families learned to sleep in layers, to bank their coals, to wake in the dark, and stoke the fire before the cold made sleeping impossible. It was exhausting. It was dangerous. Marta's wall did not cool like iron. It cooled like a hillside, slowly, reluctantly, over many hours. The heat it released at 2 in the morning was gentle, steady, and profoundly different in character from the sharp radiance of an active flame. And the bed that confused every visitor who walked through the door, was built directly into that wall. Not beside it, not leaning against it, into it. The idea did not originate on the American frontier. It is important to say that clearly, because what Marta built was not an invention. It was a memory, a piece of knowledge carried across an ocean in the mind of a woman who had grown up sleeping warm in a cold land. Across northern Europe, from the fjords of Norway to the birch forests of Finland, from the Scottish Highlands to the stone longhouses of the Faroe Islands, builders had long understood a truth that warmer climate architects never needed to learn. In a world where fire is life, you do not waste a single degree. The Scandinavian alcove bed, known by different names across different regions, but built on the same principle, was not a piece of furniture. It was an architectural feature. A sleeping chamber built directly into the wall structure of the home, often framed in timber, lined with wool, and positioned so that one or more of its walls shared mass with the main heating source. In the coldest months, sleeping in an alcove bed meant sleeping in the warmest cubic feet in the entire house. In Scotland, a nearly identical tradition produced what builders called the box bed, a fully enclosed sleeping space, sometimes with a sliding door or heavy curtain, set into a wall recess. The enclosure trapped body heat. The shared masonry wall radiated heat from the adjacent hearth. A family could sleep through a Highland winter night in relative comfort, while the rest of the room dropped to temperatures that would frost a water bucket. In Russia and across much of Central Asia, the pechka, the massive brick and clay stove that could weigh several tons and dominated the interior of peasant homes, often had a sleeping platform built across its top. Entire families slept on the warm stone surface while the fire below smoldered at its slowest. The thermal mass of the pechka was so considerable that local accounts describe it retaining usable warmth for 18 to 24 hours after the last log was added. The Chinese Kong, a raised sleeping platform heated from below by a small firebox, operated on the same fundamental principle. Different material, different geography, same physics. What these traditions shared was a refusal to separate the act of heating from the act of living. The stove was not a separate appliance in a separate room, generating heat that then, inefficiently, wastefully, drifted across open air to reach sleeping bodies on the other side of the house. The heat source and the sleeping body were joined. The wall between them was not a barrier. It was a conductor. Marta had grown up in a household with a form of this construction. She had slept in it as a child. She had felt the difference, not just in comfort, but in the quality of rest that comes from sustained, gentle warmth rather than the anxious cycle of burning hot and going cold. When she arrived in the American Midwest and looked at the land around her, she did not see a new world that required new thinking. She saw a cold climate that required old knowledge. She built accordingly. The alcove she carved into the back wall of her cabin was roughly 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 2.5 feet tall. Barely enough space for a grown woman to lie flat, but enough. The 3 walls surrounding her on all sides were stone. The stone on 3 sides had been absorbing heat for hours before she climbed in. The wool-stuffed ticking she laid on the stone floor of the alcove added a thin layer of insulation beneath her body. A heavy curtain of wool trade cloth sealed the opening. Inside that space, on the coldest recorded nights of the 1870s in that valley, the temperature rarely dropped below 62 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, it was 14 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the main cabin room, perhaps 38 degrees Fahrenheit by morning. Inside the alcove, 62 degrees Fahrenheit, minimum, sometimes warmer. She was not sleeping beside a fire. She was sleeping inside the memory of one. To understand why Marta's wall worked the way it did, it helps to forget, for a moment, everything you know about how modern heating systems operate. Modern systems heat air. That is their fundamental logic. A furnace burns fuel, warms air, and forces that air through ducts into rooms. The air warms you. The moment the furnace stops, the air begins to cool. The room temperature drops within minutes. The system must run again and again. It is a cycle of constant intervention, constant consumption, constant cost. Stone does not heat air. Stone is heat, stored, patient, structural. The process has a name in physics, thermal mass. It refers to the capacity of a material to absorb and retain thermal energy. Dense, heavy materials, stone, brick, rammed earth, adobe, water, have high thermal mass. They absorb heat slowly and release it slowly. Light materials, air, wood framing, fiberglass insulation, have low thermal mass. They respond quickly and lose heat quickly. Marta's back wall was made almost entirely of limestone and dense sandstone, 2 of the highest thermal mass materials available to a frontier builder. Limestone, depending on its density, can absorb and store roughly 0.84 BTUs per pound per degree Fahrenheit. A conservative estimate for her wall, 30 inches thick, 14 feet wide, 7 feet tall, puts its total stone mass somewhere between 3,800 and 4,500 pounds. That is not a wall. That is a heat battery. The firebox she built into the base of that wall was modest by frontier standards. Not large, not greedy. She did not want a roaring fire that would heat the room quickly and then die. She wanted a slow, controlled burn, the kind that keeps combustion gases hot for a long period, driving sustained heat deep into the stone rather than pushing it up and out the chimney in a rapid, wasteful draft. The flue path was the second critical element. Where a standard frontier chimney ran nearly straight up, efficient for draft, but terrible for heat retention, since combustion gases escape quickly and carry most of their energy out through the roof. Marta's flew wound laterally through the body of the stone before rising. The gases had to travel further. They stayed hot longer. They transferred more energy to the surrounding material before escaping. This design is sometimes called a heat exchange flue in later engineering literature, though frontier builders who used it would not have recognized that term. They simply knew, from tradition or from trial and error, that a longer path meant a warmer wall. The physics of convection also worked in her favor. Heat rises. The firebox sat at the base of the wall. As the stone above the firebox warmed, it created a gentle upward thermal gradient. The lower portions of the wall warming first, then the energy slowly migrating upward through the mass. By evening, when the fire had burned down to coals, the entire wall, top to bottom, front to back, held residual heat at somewhere between 90 degrees Fahrenheit and 110 degrees Fahrenheit at its inner face. That surface temperature is not hot enough to burn. It is hot enough to warm air in contact with it. Slowly, continuously, for between 8 and 14 hours after the last log. The alcove, set into that wall at sleeping height, was surrounded on 3 sides by stone radiating at those temperatures. The curtain across the opening trapped the warmth inside the sleeping space. Marta's body heat contributed its own small but meaningful share. The result was a self-sustaining thermal pocket, a microenvironment that held its temperature long after the main room had gone cold. It was not magic. It was geometry, mass, and the physics of slow heat release. What it required was patience. Patience to build it right. Patience to fire it correctly. Patience to let the stone do the work instead of demanding instant warmth from a roaring blaze. That patience was, perhaps, the rarest material of all on the American frontier. Most settlers wanted heat fast. Marta wanted heat long. In that distinction, fast versus long, lay the entire difference between freezing and warmth. It arrived without much warning. That was the nature of the northern plains in the deep of winter. The worst storms rarely announced themselves politely. A ridge of cold air descended from the Canadian interior sometime in early February, and by nightfall the temperature in the valley had dropped to 2 degrees Fahrenheit. By midnight, it was pushing below zero. Wind came with it. Not a steady wind, worse than that. Gusts that hit the cabin walls at irregular intervals, finding every gap, every imperfect chink in the clay, every seam where 2 logs met at less than a perfect angle. The kind of cold that doesn't just chill a room, it pressurizes it, forcing frigid air through every weakness in the structure. In the cabins around the settlement, the night unfolded in a predictable and exhausting pattern. Families woke every 2 to 3 hours to stoke their fires. The cast-iron stoves that had seemed adequate in November now radiated heat only in a narrow radius. Close enough to warm your hands, not close enough to warm the far corner where the children slept. Wood piles that had looked generous in October were revealing themselves to be dangerously short. One family, according to community records from that winter, burned through their remaining supply before dawn and spent the final hours of the night huddled together beneath every blanket they owned, waiting for the light. In Marta's cabin, something different was happening. She had loaded the firebox that evening with a measured amount of dense hardwood, elm and red oak, both of which burned slower and hotter than the pine that most settlers favored for its easy splitting. She was not trying to fill the room with heat quickly. She was feeding the wall. She built the fire up steadily over the course of 2 hours, letting the stone absorb at its own pace. And then she let it settle to a long, slow burn before she climbed into the alcove and drew the curtain closed. By the time the temperature outside reached its lowest point, somewhere around -4 degrees Fahrenheit, based on accounts from settlers who had brought thermometers, Marta's stone wall had been absorbing heat for more than 6 hours. Its inner face, the face that formed 3 sides of the sleeping alcove, was radiating at an estimated 95 degrees Fahrenheit to 105 degrees Fahrenheit. Not scorching, not uncomfortable, simply warm, persistently, reliably, structurally warm. Inside the alcove, with the curtain drawn and her own body adding its modest contribution, the temperature held at approximately 64 degrees Fahrenheit through the coldest hours of the night. She did not wake to stoke a fire. She did not pull additional blankets over herself in the small hours. She slept. The main room of the cabin, outside the alcove, dropped to around 36 degrees Fahrenheit by morning, cold enough to see your breath, cold enough to make bare feet on the earthen floor deeply unpleasant. But the fire had not gone completely cold. The stone had continued to radiate into the room throughout the night, and the cast-iron pot near the hearth had not frozen. The water bucket, kept near the base of the wall, was still liquid. Across the settlement, 2 water buckets froze solid. One family's milk supply was lost. A neighbor who had built his cabin with a conventional loft sleeping area reported that the loft temperature dropped so severely that his youngest child developed a serious cough that persisted through March. When morning came and neighbors began to compare the night's experience, as frontier communities always did after a hard freeze, trading information about what had held and what had failed, Marta's cabin became the subject of a different kind of conversation than it had been in the fall. The laughter, if it had ever been genuine, was gone. It started with questions. Polite ones, at first, the careful, slightly embarrassed inquiries of people who had been skeptical and now needed information without quite admitting why. A woman from 2 plots over stopped by on the second morning after the hard freeze, ostensibly to return a borrowed tin. She stayed for nearly an hour. She asked, in the roundabout way that pride requires, how Marta had managed to keep her water from freezing. She looked at the back wall. She pressed her hand against the stone. She did not say much, but she looked. A week later, a family from the far end of the settlement arrived with a more direct request. Their youngest had been sick since the cold snap. The cabin was impossible to keep warm. The conventional stove simply couldn't sustain enough heat through the night. They asked if the children could sleep at Marta's for a few nights while the father made improvements to his own structure. She said yes. The children slept in the alcove, all 3 of them, pressed together in the narrow stone chamber with a curtain across the opening and the wall radiating steadily behind them. In the morning, the youngest ate breakfast with color in his cheeks for the first time in 2 weeks. Word spread the way it always does in small, isolated communities, slowly at first, then all at once. By the time the second hard freeze hit in late February, Marta had received visits from nearly every adult in the settlement. Most came under some practical pretext. All of them eventually asked about the wall. She showed them what she had built. She explained the firebox depth, roughly 14 inches into the base of the stone mass, with a fireback of dense sandstone to reflect radiant heat inward rather than letting it escape through the rear of the structure. She described the flue path, not straight up, but angled laterally through the body of the wall for nearly 4 feet before rising vertically, giving the combustion gases time to surrender their heat to the surrounding stone before escaping. She showed them the alcove dimensions, the wool lining, the way the curtain sealed the sleeping space into its own thermal pocket. Some of the men nodded slowly, working it out in practical terms. Some of the women asked specifically about the sleeping arrangement, not the engineering, but the experience of it. What did it feel like? Was it dark? Was it cramped? Marta's answer to the last question was always the same. She said it felt like sleeping inside the earth. Not cold earth, warm earth. The deep, settled warmth of something that had been holding heat for a very long time. 2 families attempted versions of the design before the following winter. Neither achieved Marta's results precisely. The stone selection mattered enormously, and both builders used material that was too porous, which limited heat retention, but both reported meaningfully warmer sleeping conditions than they had experienced the previous year. One man estimated he burned roughly 30% less wood over the course of the winter, simply by concentrating his fire's energy into the mass rather than trying to fill the open room with radiant air heat. That 30% was not a trivial number. On the frontier, wood represented time, labor, and safety. Every cord saved was a margin of survival preserved for a worse week, a longer freeze, an unexpected illness that kept the woodcutter inside. The thermal wall was not a luxury. It was arithmetic the cold mathematics of staying alive with the resources available. Marta never called it an invention. When pressed, she said simply that she had built what her grandmother had built, adjusted for the materials she could find. The knowledge had not come from a book. It had come from a childhood spent in a cold country, watching careful people survive. The question deserves an honest answer. If this approach worked so well, why did it disappear? The short answer is that it didn't disappear everywhere, but it was systematically pushed aside in the American context by a combination of industrial convenience, changing fuel economics, and a cultural assumption that newer always meant better. By the 1880s and 1890s, cast iron stove manufacturing had become a significant industry. Companies like Glenwood, Round Oak, and later Monarch were producing stoves that were affordable, portable, and, most importantly, fast. They heated a room in 30 minutes. They required no masonry expertise to install. They could be bought from a catalog and delivered by rail. For a settler who needed heat now, who didn't have 3 weeks and a riverbed of fieldstone to build a thermal wall, the catalog stove was an obvious choice. The logic of thermal mass requires patience. Patience to build, patience to fire, patience to let the stone do its slow work. Industrial America was not interested in patience. It was interested in throughput. Then came central heating. By the early 20th century, coal-fired furnaces with hot water or steam distribution were becoming standard in middle-class homes. The entire model of heating shifted. Instead of building heat storage into the structure of the house itself, you ran pipes through a frame structure and pushed heat to wherever it was needed, whenever it was needed, at the turn of a valve. This system worked. In the narrow sense of the word, it moved heat through a building. It worked fine, but it created a fundamental architectural dependency. The building itself became thermally passive, a shell with no heat storage capacity of its own. When the furnace ran, it was warm. When the furnace stopped, the building began to lose heat almost immediately because there was nothing in the walls, floors, or structure to hold it. Modern residential construction, for the most part, operates on this same logic. A well-insulated modern house holds heat by slowing its escape through foam and fiberglass, a resistance strategy. It does not hold heat by storing it, a mass strategy. The two approaches are fundamentally different in how they behave over time. And the mass strategy has characteristics that the resistance strategy simply cannot replicate. A high-mass wall continues to emit heat after the energy source has stopped. A well-insulated but low-mass wall begins to lose heat within minutes of the furnace cycling off. In a power outage, in a grid failure, in a fuel shortage, in any emergency that interrupts the continuous energy supply that modern heating requires, a low-mass house becomes cold very quickly. A high-mass house holds its temperature for hours, sometimes for most of a day, depending on construction. This is not a theoretical concern. It is a practical one that becomes relevant every time a major winter storm knocks out power across a region, which happens somewhere in North America with significant frequency every single winter. The builders and architects of the 20th century were not ignorant. They made choices based on the economics and technologies of their time. But in optimizing for speed, affordability, and industrial scalability, they traded away something real. The frontier cabin with its thermal wall was not primitive. It was solving a problem that modern construction still hasn't fully solved: how to build a structure that stays warm not just when it's being actively heated, but when it's not. Marta's cabin, by surviving accounts, was still standing and still occupied 40 years after she built it. The back wall had never been modified. The alcove was still in use. The wall, it seems, had a longer memory than the people who had once laughed at it. There is a particular kind of wisdom that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with credentials or documentation. It does not appear in the architectural journals of its era. It is passed between people who trust cold more than they trust theory, people who have slept in stone-walled alcoves and understood, from the evidence of their own body's warmth, that something real was happening inside that wall. Marta's cabin was, in the end, an argument made in stone. Not a written argument, not a spoken one, a structural argument, a physical demonstration that the relationship between heat and shelter could be organized differently than the standard of her time assumed. The bed was not separate from the house. The bed was the house, or rather, the most important part of it. Every design decision she made, from the choice of stone to the path of the flue to the dimensions of the alcove, was oriented toward a single goal: making the act of sleep warm, sustained, and independent of the vagaries of an active fire. She was not trying to heat a room. She was trying to heat a body, and she had understood, from a lifetime of cold experience, that heating a body is a far smaller and more achievable problem than heating a room. The thermal physics behind her wall are, by modern standards, well understood. Limestone at her wall's estimated density has a specific heat capacity of roughly 0.22 BTU per pound per degree Fahrenheit. At a conservative mass of 4,000 pounds and a temperature differential of 80 degrees Fahrenheit between the fully charged wall and a cold morning room, the stored energy in that wall at its peak represented somewhere between 70,000 and 90,000 BTUs, enough released slowly over 8 to 12 hours to maintain the alcove at sleeping temperature through even the hardest freeze in that valley's recorded history. Those are the numbers. But numbers are the least of what she built. What she built, at its core, was a philosophy of sufficiency. The cabin was small by design, not because she lacked ambition, but because she understood that a smaller volume of air is easier to hold warm than a large one. The alcove was narrow by design, because a body generates heat, and a small enclosed space around a body requires far less supplemental energy to remain comfortable than an open room. The stone was heavy by design, because mass is the only material that can hold heat long enough to carry you through the coldest hours without asking you to wake and tend a fire. Every choice said the same thing: use less, store more, waste nothing. That principle did not die with Marta or with the frontier generation that briefly learned from her. It lives in the passive solar buildings of the American Southwest, where thick adobe walls absorb daytime heat and release it slowly through the desert night. It lives in the rocket mass heaters that off-grid builders have rediscovered over the last 30 years. Modern interpretations of the same thermal mass logic, built from cob and firebrick instead of frontier fieldstone. It lives in the F-ship construction movement, in the growing interest in rammed earth and compressed earth block, in every building that takes seriously the idea that the structure itself should participate in the thermal management of the space it encloses. The knowledge was never lost. It was set aside, and it is being picked up again, not because it is fashionable, but because it works. Because there are still winters. Because fuel is still finite. Because there will always be nights when the temperature drops faster than anyone expected, and the question that matters is not how quickly your heating system can respond, but how long your building can hold what it was given. Marta asked that question in the late 1870s, with fieldstone and a firebox and a sleeping alcove carved into a wall that everyone said was too thick. The wall answered for 40 years. The answer is still available. The stone is still in the riverbed. The physics have not changed. All that is required is the patience to build it right, and the willingness to sleep inside the warmth of something you trusted enough to build slowly. Educational and historical content only. This video is intended for historical and informational purposes and does not substitute for professional engineering advice or applicable building codes. Always consult a qualified professional before undertaking construction projects.